Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorgen, and as always, I'm here with the illustrious Paul. And Paul, it's kind of interesting because last week we put out a few gold and silver updates, but things have been continuing hot and heavy. And of course, the big thing now that's going around social media, whether it has any real impetus behind it, is the auditing and taking a look at Fort Knox. Now, interestingly enough, Treasury Secretary Bissett has decided to channel his inner Mnuchin and come out on come out on CNBC and report all the gold is there and has no plans to visit Fort Knox. Well, with that being said, of course, we got to take a look at how gold may be integrated into Trump's proposed sovereign wealth fund, and if really gold and silver is something that the federal government, the Trump administration, has any real desire to be made transparent. Paul, as always, want to thank you for being a part of the discussion, and definitely want to get your thoughts on this whole what has really become a viral thing, at least in social media, of doing an audit of the gold and having it become part of the financial system once again.
Yeah, well, obviously, thanks for joining as well, Ken. It's always a pleasure when we get together. Well, yeah, we had to come back to this subject because, yes, it's generated a huge amount of excitement and interest. And, I think Elon Musk kind of got the ball rolling in a sense by talking about auditing Fort Knox. And is it there or isn't it there? He wasn't saying one way or the other. But then, Trump's now jumped on the bandwagon and is backing this. Apparently, it's part of the Doge effort to confirm that all the US gold reserves at Fort Knox are really there. And now, of course, there's always been this debate as to how often is it audited. Some people are claiming it's audited yearly, there was a claim that it hasn't been, audited yearly. And of course, it's led to a lot of speculation, which, for people like us, we've talked about this for more years than I care to remember, that, how much or how little of the supposedly in total, because it's not all obviously at Fort Knox, of the 8,100 tons of gold does the United States have. So Musk's gone, we're going to go into Fort Knox to make sure the gold's there. Trump said this, and he said, we hope everything is fine with Fort Knox, is just to make sure the gold there. And of course, he was asked the question, well, where would the gold have gone? And he said, Trump, well, if the gold isn't there, we're going to be very upset. Well, absolutely, because if it's not there, this will cause absolute pandemonium and major problems for the dollar and also for the US Treasury, US dollar complex. So, it's interesting, of course, that Besant was asked about this, and he said we do an audit every year. Now, it's perceived wisdom says there hasn't been an audit since 1974. Okay, there will be people who disagree, and Besant's one of those. He actually made the point that the last audit was done on the 30th of September of 2024. Okay, so that's his perspective. I'm not going to argue or disagree with it because I don't know whether that happened or didn't. But conventional wisdom suggests it didn't, but that doesn't mean, of course, it didn't. Too many didn'ts there. But what he also said is that all the gold's present and accounted for, and he was happy to arrange for any inspection by any senator who wishes to go. Now, I know there's Mike Lee, has been on Exco, and he tried to go there and he wasn't allowed, basically. And of course, there's also statements, and Rand Paul's made these points previously. There needs to be greater transparency about the gold. I mean, and obviously, because he said somewhere on US TV that he'd been trying to verify it himself for a decade. I mean, we know Ron Paul had a call for Fort Knox's gold to be audited. I remember this, and a bill was proposed in 2011. It never went anywhere. I mean, so this is just this ongoing debate as to is it there or isn't it there? It's interesting, Paul did receive permission to visit during the first Trump administration. For some reason, the trip didn't materialize. Dan Mnuchin and actually Mitch McConnell visited the vaults in 2017. And, you know, and there was a lot of course speculation. Is it there? Isn't it there? I mean, and the question, of course, with this is, I mean, if Trump had a proper audit, and what I mean by a proper audit, that in fact you not only ascertain what is there, but you assay all the bars to make sure they are physical gold. The reason I say that is because there was an occasion where gold was shipped to China from the US, and it turned out to be gold-plated tungsten bars, which was acutely embarrassing for everyone concerned, not least the Chinese. And there's always been this question, well, is it even there? If it is there, is it real gold? So just turning up with a camera crew and walking around doesn't prove anything in any way, shape, or form. That's not an audit. That's just a photo opportunity to suggest it is. The issue is, of course, is you would arguably think someone would have advised Trump if it wasn't the case. And, you know, if they end up actually doing this and turning up, then the question is, what happens if it isn't what we all conventional wisdom suggests it is? Then that's a major problem. So Besant coming out saying all the gold's there. He says he's got no plans to visit Fort Knox. And then, of course, there's been all this speculation that the real reason all the gold's going back to the United States from London and elsewhere, including Switzerland, and we'll come on to that a bit later, then the reason for that is because the United States is going to revalue gold on its balance sheet from $42 to whatever it would be, let's say for $3,000, just for argument's sake. Yeah, he came out and said that he isn't going to revalue gold reserves in a sovereign wealth fund. What he actually said is, when I said about monetizing assets on the balance sheet, revaluing gold was not what he had in mind. So basically what he's saying there is, A, I'm not going to revalue gold, and B, I'm not going to include it in a sovereign wealth fund because it would be irrelevant to suggest you were going to revalue it or not if you intended putting it in a sovereign wealth fund, because you're not going to leave it at the value it is because it would be it'd be ridiculously undervalued. So there's no, well, okay, and people will say, well, he's just saying that. But, you know, at the end of the day, he might be just saying it because he means it, not because he's making the point just to act as a smokescreen. Now, of course, that's going to immediately set people off in a tailspin going, hang on a minute, that's not what I believe it to be, and they won't want to necessarily accept what Besant said. But there's also a point worth making before I pass over to you, Ken, with regards to this big spike in the comics. We saw this at the start of the pandemic, exactly the same. And the reason then was self-explanatory, because there was a fear you wouldn't be able to get metal shipped to the United States because all aircraft might be grounded and no one really knew what would happen in terms of shipping anything around the world, because the entire world might have gone into lockdown, which of course didn't happen in terms of trade and commerce to a large extent. So eventually the realization came, well, this isn't an issue. And then the price kind of just fell back, and the demand likewise fell back. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen this time because we don't know. Equally, it could be partially related to people's belief that Trump's going to impose tariffs, although I have to say, having said that, it's not materialized now, so I don't really think necessarily that's the case anymore. But I do fear there's a little bit of a sense of, well, let's put two and two together, excuse me, and come up with 22 because Mnuchin said, sorry, not Mnuchin, Besant said something, and therefore that makes it so. And based on what he said, and that isn't indeed the case. So I think there are just some initial thoughts on this. I wanted to go into a bit more detail about what might well be happening in the actual gold market, but also let's not lose sight of the fact that silver keeps rising. Okay, there's an argument the ratio has to stay at least around 90-1, which is that why silver's also spiking in the process. But equally, there are clearly silver shortages because we're seeing the delta also between the London and the COMEX, which begs the question, who wants silver? Because sovereign nations don't have silver on their balance sheets. Maybe the Chinese do secretly, but effectively nobody does. And also central banks don't hold silver either. Yes, they most certainly hold gold. Well, not all of them, but some of them.
Yeah, you have to wonder, especially with silver. I mean, the ever since the revelation of DeepSeek and in a week's time, we've had two new AIs come out, Grok 3 and I think this new chip out from Microsoft, et cetera. So, when it comes to silver, the AI game is going to, have a demand for that through the roof. But you've also seen where in the paper markets, primarily the COMEX, they have done everything in their power to keep it uh, under 33. Every time it crosses 33 is an instantaneous slam. And they've been doing that now for the last three weeks or more. So I think rather than necessarily they know that gold is out of the bag, silver is the one thing that they're fighting tooth and nail to try to keep the price down. And unfortunately, because of inflation, global inflation, many of the miners just aren't really making, the profits that they should with the rising demand for metals. So if you start sticking it to the miners, then, you're going to really exacerbate supply problems even more, especially if they can't get energy costs down. But with that being said, the fascinating thing, I see it from a couple of different viewpoints. One, we are getting validations because of the lack of transparency. We are getting validations that there are shortages at the primary places, whether it's Switzerland, whether it's London, and whoever's buying it or demanding delivery. And you can see that from the COT reports, Commitment of Trader reports, that deliveries demands are spiking through the roof as compared to past history. But also, gold is something that is being talked about on social media en masse. And you have to wonder because the media for a long time, poo-pooed cryptocurrencies. Then all of a sudden they got into pushing cryptocurrencies. But every time that somebody would bring up gold or silver, they would slam that down as being a pet rock or an ancient relic, or it's not significance, it's not money, it's nothing. Well, the more and more and more today you get into social media, you have these influencers, and we saw this with the crypto bros, etc. One powerful influencer can get 1 million or more people to not only have an interest, but to put money into it. And if there's shortages now, especially the demand deliveries from the big players or the bullion banks or whomever, especially if it's getting transferred to Shanghai or Dubai or wherever, if you get the retail investor suddenly demanding and wanting for gold, that could be, just as much as Bitcoin's soaring to 100,000. This could be something that could shoot gold in the physical markets or the demand for delivery, or at least a wake-up call that people are going to start looking at what the whole gold and silver futures spot system is about. And from there, that's going to be where Pandora's box is open. And I think we're slowly getting to that point when you have Elon Musk making references to Fort Knox and the gold. You have, the call and demands for a transparent audit, not just a paper audit, which is what, they've done in the past, people are looking back to 2014, 2016, when Germany demanded their gold and it didn't get delivered to them for years. Where's the gold? And people are asking the question. And I think that's the one thing that they fear the most.
Well, yeah, it's all about credibility. If your credibility is shot to bits, you're in big trouble. And this is basically almost what's happening because, as I made a post on X, but it's worth reiterating, if you have to lease gold now at record high rates in markets, it's because you clearly have acute gold shortages. No one is prepared to let go of their gold. So you've got to entice someone to lease it at a much higher rate. And then what happens is, because in theory, all gold should be, and the contracts don't exist like this, but if you had a 1 ounce contract, it should be backed by 1 ounce of gold. So as long as, if you've got all the gold to satisfy your contracts, you should have no problem whatsoever. But of course, that clearly isn't the case. So if you're having to lease gold at these extremely high rates, then you satisfy contractual obligations. The problem is you then have to replace that gold you've leased by acquiring what you sold in the open market. So where do you get it from? And this can be a huge problem. This might partially explain why in London it's taking so long for delivery, because because basically it's becoming a nightmare to source gold, whether it's the first part of the transaction in terms of the lease, or then subsequently someone getting hold of the metal because they've leased it and sold it and having to replace the leased gold back with whoever they're leasing it from, not necessarily the Bank of England, whoever it might be. And the risk in doing that, because of the way the price is soaring, you could have significant losses being accrued each time you undertake such a transaction. And then you come back to the need to satisfy demand in the COMEX, where the notion of this 1 ounce of physical gold equating to 1 ounce of paper contract is actually, I don't know, 100 ounces maybe of paper for 1 ounce of physical. So this is where then you have an enormous problem, because you can have an arbitrage, you can suck metal out of wherever you can. You might be able to suck it out of Switzerland, with 190 plus tons of gold was shipped from Switzerland to the United States in January, is one example. But if, for argument's sake, your deficit is, and I'm just using simple maths here, it's not the actual figures, but if your deficit was 1 million ounces of gold, and this only helps you to reduce that deficit to 500,000, you've still got a problem. And that problem hasn't gone away. And this is why I explained all this back in 2013, why that could happen, what the consequences would then be for true price discovery. In essence, we're seeing that, but is this the end of paper markets? Well, we don't know. This could all change next week or next month. As things stand, we're seeing an indication of what I precisely said would happen when you had effectively no gold available in the West. It doesn't mean literally no gold, but you're struggling to plug holes in the dam everywhere. And for me, the only questions then outstanding is, who is seeking delivery in the United States and why? Now, in terms of the COMEX, there's no way the United States government buys through the COMEX. Absolutely not. They will buy through opaque markets. So do we know what's going on there? Were the real tonnage exchange hands? And on that basis, that would give us an indication. Now, as things stand, it's not clear that the United States government in any way, shape, or form is buying. Yes, there's a lot of gold entering the US. I mean, in February alone, COMEX delivery notices are, I don't know, I haven't got all the information going back decades or anything, but already it's about 220 tons in February, and it way exceeds the previous high, which we saw back, I think, in June of 2020, where by the end of the month, there was about 180 tons for delivery. So you get the idea. There is this elevated demand. But who is it? We don't know. Yes, there might be, and there is more gold accruing at bullion banks. Is this related partly to tariffs? Maybe, and likely to some extent, but not entirely. Who is major holders of gold in the COMEX? Well, it might be institutional investors anywhere in the world. Could be someone in China or India or a whole raft of other people who are now wanting delivery. Why do they want delivery? Well, maybe they're concerned about broader geopolitical, economic, financial reasons. It's not like the pandemic era, but it could be something that equates to that in an analogous sense of the word. But again, we don't have the transparency to know this. But the problem is, I think we can argue whether people believe Besant or not. I would say, why would he say this if he then intends to change his mind? Politicians don't tend to do that because it makes them look extremely idiotic. So, I mean, okay, granted, you would have to be careful in saying he was doing it. But he could have answered it where he could have said, well, at the moment, we haven't made any consideration as to what assets we want to take from the balance sheet and monetize them and put them in a sovereign wealth fund. But he was very clear about this. Okay, we'll see if that transpires to be the case. But then on that basis, if the US government isn't doing that, and we've said before why that is unlikely, because it would set a precedent. If you decide to revalue gold to 3,000 ounces, well, you're putting a floor under it. The United States probably wouldn't want to do that. It's not good for the dollar. It's not good for the US Treasury, US dollar complex. And it's, how much money is it going to accrue as a result of it? $1 trillion, maybe, if you're optimistic. Well, how long is that you're going to burn that through that? The way the US burns through money, it's not going to last very long at all. So, what's the value in having this? And so there are many unanswered questions. People have jumped to conclusions that aren't, I feel, necessarily correct. And we'll see if there is actually a proper audit of Fort Knox and not just well, I went there, saw it with my own eyes, and therefore it exists. But in essence, there are certainly ongoing issues with both London and New York in terms of physical gold and silver, and that is continuing. And the fact that the silver is an issue as well, I think, is more interesting for me than gold, because you can understand readily why gold might be the case, but why physical silver? Why is that a problem? Who suddenly wants huge amounts of physical metal in the United States, physical silver? Why? For what purpose? Well, maybe it is industrial. But again, maybe there are players who have access to US markets who want physical delivery because it doesn't apply to what's going on in the US. Maybe it's China, maybe it's India, maybe it's someone else. But there are too many unknowns at this point in time to make definitive statements, and making basically analogous kind of assessment of a situation where we take something and apply it to something we think it's related to with something of this complexity is not always very helpful. You need a first principles basis, which someone reminded me of this, which is what's used in physics, for example, where you assess everything, strip it down to its fundamental constituent parts and assess what's the reality of this and what could it mean. And that's what basically we've done with this podcast. And at this point, you can't get definitive answers. So, keep watching in the coming weeks, and maybe we see this shortage continue. Maybe this eventually forces paper markets to be 1 ounce of gold to 1 ounce of paper. But maybe it will disappear, and in a few weeks, the price will not be in dollar terms where it currently is. Because, again, we don't know. We don't know whether this is a proper transition to how gold markets and silver markets should operate in the West, or is it transient because of factors like tariffs, like concerns about other broader issues that may go away or may not go away.
Yeah, in the end, I think the real question has to be when a single individual of note or authority comes out and makes a statement. Usually, it's their personal opinion, doesn't have any meaning. But in the last week, we had Jay Powell, who was asked at one of his FOMCs whether, what's going on with the gold, and he gave an obfuscated, answer to it. Basent has come out and made, everything's fine. I know the audit, it's fine. And then, of course, we have, in regards to the FOIA requests to the New York Fed, to West Point, et cetera, that get completely ignored. The more that there is less transparency in this entire process, the more the quote unquote conspiracy of this will continue. And it's going to be in complete opposition to what the mainstream media, to what, the government wants. And that's people to just forget about gold and silver and focus on these other shiny baubles that they want to try to push onto the public. Paul, as always, thank you for your insight and for being a part of this discussion.
Yes, and likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you, as always, for all of your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.